Hello and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch, and today I'm doing my October book wrap-up. It is Halloween today, and I am joined by I do realize this is not Halloween-y, but at the grocery store they had these sugar skulls, because they sell them at Halloween because people are stupid, but it's purple and cute and has a succulent, so I couldn't not get it. I don't observe Cinco de Mayo, but it's adorable. And anyway, onwards and upwards. Earth Democracy. I think I talked about this a bit in my last book wrap-up because I just about finished it and then took a few more days to finish it, but it's really good. Somebody is angrily honking their horns out there, if you can hear that. Anyway, she does not mince her words, and her main concern is for the poor, mostly of India, and not for the feelings of billionaires and multinational corporations, which I appreciate because they'll be fine. Nobody needs to care what they think. They'll be fine. I mean, the end of the world could happen tomorrow and they'd probably still be fine and the rest of us would be hooped. So she's mostly concerned with everybody else. And this was interesting because like on social media there's a lot of debate about what's better or worse between capitalism and communism, as though those are the only two options. And I really find that frustrating because they're not the only two options, and they're both terrible options. They've both killed millions of people and really benefited only a handful of people. So yeah, I'm not going to go in for either of those options. What Vandana Shiva talks about is more local economies, more community-based economies, in which the earth and the plants and the wildlife and the ecosystems as a whole are considered equal participants with humans, which is great. I can get behind that. It's not something that's talked about, I think, often enough. And I think she probably annoys a lot of powerful people, which may possibly make me like her even more. So yeah, that was a good one. I'll have to read more of her books. It's been a while. And then I read Our Green Heart by Diana Beresford-Kroeger. She was at a literary festival near me and is surprisingly hilarious. She's a lot of fun to listen to. Highly recommend it. And I read this book twice as soon as I got it. Like, basically as soon as I finished it, I started over at the beginning. And it's so good. And then I read To Speak for the Trees, which is also by her. It's more memoirish. This Our Green Heart is the soul and science of forests. So she talks about what's going to need to happen with forests in order for the world not to go up in flames. So, many good points are made there. Her biography also in the back, and this is why I got the hard copy, because I read, where does it start here? I listened to it as an audiobook, because it was included in my Audible membership, I think. But she's got something about the Ogham here at the back. The Celtic alphabet of trees makes up this section of the book. And so she goes through, so she was a Brehon ward when she was young. And so she didn't really have a family to raise her, so she was taught traditional Irish beliefs by a lot of local people in her community. Back when, I think she's like in her 80s now, or something like that. Apologies if that's wrong, but she, this was a while back now. And she was one of the last people, at least, to receive that sort of education. And so she's got this section in the back for the Celtic alphabet of trees, and basically it's a chapter on each letter and the associated tree, and what it means in her interpretation of things. So I got that because I want to maybe sometime this winter or in the spring learn more about the Ogham. I've got another book that was recommended by Laura O'Brien, which I talked about in my book haul video, but this one, yeah, I wanted to use it together with that, because I know she'd talked about how she came by this information. And then I read The Sweetness of a Simple Life. This is tips for healthier, happier, and kinder living from a visionary natural scientist. It's good. It's not as outstanding, I think, as the other two. It's got a section on health and food, home and garden, the larger world. So it's got like grocery list, home tips, root cellars, city forests, industrial food, just all sorts of different chapters, and some of them were more interesting to me than others. Some have been, it's sort of a more beginner book, I think, for this sort of thing. If people have lived a really industrial food-centered life with very little plant interaction, it might be a good place to start. It was a little, mostly stuff I'd heard before, but it's not a bad beginner book in that regard. I just didn't, I liked it. I just didn't love it as much as the other two. Okay. Then I read Going to Seed by Kate Neville. She is a political science professor and at the School of the Environment in Toronto, where she studies global resource politics, energy transitions and technologies, and community resistance. When not in the city, she lives in an off-grid cabin in the woods. So this is a series of essays. And at first I thought it was really slow going, and then was like, well, duh, that's kind of the point. So it's a book about, it's essays on idleness, nature, and sustainable work. So she talks a lot about ideas around productivity, ideas around leisure, and green energy, and the environmental crisis, and how those all interact, and her thoughts on those. She doesn't have a lot of I don't know, it's not a book that tries to convince people of any sort of militant points politically. It's really more a book where she wonders out loud about some of these things and can make you wonder with her and just sort of think about. Clearly the climate crisis is urgent, but one of the essays was on the question of what if doing less, staying home, consuming less, just doing less instead of more was actually the way to address it, or one way to address it. And so she's got some interesting ideas. I liked this one a lot. She was also at this literary festival with Diana Beresford-Kroeger. They had an event together. It was fun. Then, I listened to Fresh Banana Leaves by Jessica Hernandez. And so she also, sort of like Vandana Shiva, she has ideas about local indigenous economies and environmentalism. They are not as well developed as Vandana Shiva's ideas. It's the sort of book that needed, I don't know, another editor and a couple of rewrites or something to really develop these ideas more fully. It was an idea of the book, and the idea was interesting. The execution of the book was a bit meh. There are other books out there that talk about indigenous environmentalism and indigenous economies and local community-based economies better, Earth Democracy being one of the really good ones. And I just feel like it was a good idea. It is not well executed. Then I listened to Blackthorn's Botanical Magic by Amy Blackthorn. This was another book that was a good beginner book. I didn't find it particularly interesting. I mean, it was passingly interesting, but I've already got things that I do around plant interactions, so it just, I don't know, is a bit so-so for me. Kind of the same thing happened with Honoring Your Ancestors by Mallorie Vaudoise. It was good. It was beginner. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting tired of introduction to this, that, and the other thing books. Maybe that's it. Because neither of them were bad books. And for beginners, they might actually be excellent books. But they just, at this time and place, didn't quite do it for me. One book that really did interest me quite a lot was this, Walking the Twilight Path, the Gothic Book of the Dead. And so this is by Michelle Belanger, and it's so interesting. It's a really unique book. It is very much not a beginner book. So basically, part 1 is approaching the threshold. With each chapter, there's a journal exercise, and some of them have meditations. There's a lot of journaling and meditations and journaling and meditations, and I didn't do all of the exercises because I'm not entirely sure the path was for me, but I read all the other parts and they were fascinating. So part 2 is The Way of All Flesh, which is one of the grosser chapters that deals with death. So it's got chapters on accepting impermanence, facing your fears, the weight of eternity, disposing of bodies, return to the elements, and giving up the ghost. And then part 3 goes into the more spiritual side of things, connecting with the cemetery, a necromantic medicine bag, life among the dead, preparing the way, and the gates of life and death. And then there's some appendices with like incenses, that's a strange word, and oils, offerings for the dead, deities associated with death, that sort of thing. It's very well put together with bibliography and an index, and it's really well organized, and I mean, she put a lot of thought into this. It's a really good book. It's a really strange book. It's sometimes a really disturbing book, but it's a fascinating one. She also, I tabbed this page. This is The Graveyard Poets, so poems written about the dead or graveyards or cemeteries or whatever. And so I will have to look some of these up. But yeah, it gave me a lot to think about, and I may reread it again someday, especially if that ends up being more a path I want to go down. Certainly when you garden and interact with the natural world, you do come to have a different relationship with death, and its cycles. So yeah, pretty interesting. Then I listened to a few other audiobooks. One was The Corn Maiden and Other Nightmares by Joyce Carol Oates. It was really pretty good. The first story, The Corn Maiden, was the best one. The last one, I can't remember what it's called, was also excellent. There were a few in the middle that were like good, but didn't blow me away. One book that was really fascinating was Experimental Film by Gemma Files. Now I'm not a film person, so people who are film people may like this even more, because the main character is an experimental filmmaker. And so the premise and the structure of the book are really interesting. And I don't know if anybody's done this sort of thing before in a novel, but it seemed really cool to me. It's got a little bit of folklore elements in there too. It's a very cool book. It's kind of horror-ish, and really strange. And yeah, I enjoyed that one. River Woman, River Demon by Jennifer Givhan was also it was a book that the premise again was phenomenal, out of the park premise. The main character drove me around the bend. She was so annoying and so immature, and just made some like astonishingly terrible life choices. I mean, I realize everybody makes bad life choices at some point. You do stupid things, you regret the stupid things, okay. But like the lack of self-awareness there was just, and also the lack of consequences for her terrible life choices. It was strange. I didn't like her. I liked a lot of things about the book, and the story was so good. The main character drove me around the bend though. So yeah, I don't know if I recommend that. I mean, maybe I do. I'd be curious what else that author ends up writing. If because you can improve on characterization as you write more books. So maybe she will. Because yeah, the story idea was really cool. Then I actually listened to this as an audiobook, When Things Get Dark. Stories inspired by Shirley Jackson, edited by Ellen Datlow. So it's got Joyce Carol Oates, Carmen Maria Machado, Paul Tremblay, Stephen Grave Jones, a whole bunch of people. Some of them I have to look up because this is one of the best collections of short stories I may have ever read. Possibly, like, ever. It was so good. They were all so different and inventive, and like this sort of gothic, whoops, as I dropped the book on the table, Shirley Jackson style horror is like, if I'm gonna get into horror, that's what I'm gonna enjoy the most, I think. The gross stuff I can live without, thank you. But this was really, so there are, I don't know, maybe 20 stories. Some of them longer, some of them really short, but they are just all so good. Like, there were no, usually in a collection of short stories, there are stories that I really don't like, some that are amazing, and a bunch that are somewhere in the middle. This one was like, there were no duds. It was very impressive. I'll have to read it again sometime. Yeah, so that was fun. Then I read, part of the reason I got that one was, well, because it said inspired by Shirley Jackson on the cover, so of course I got it. But there are a couple other writers here who also came to this literary festival. One of them was Stephen Graham Jones. So I read Ledfeather, which is not a horror genre novel, but there are elements of history that are just horrifying because, you know, massacres and starvation and racism and yeah, so like there are horrific things that have happened, but it's not particularly that genre. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, it's really good. It's a little disorienting to drop into at the beginning. I wasn't, for the first couple chapters, I wasn't entirely clear what was, you know, who, what, where was I, what was happening. But I figured it out. And the structure is actually kind of cool. So it flips back and forth between modern day on, I think it's the reserve, the Blackfeet Reserve in Montana. I'm Canadian, so I'm just like 2 hours north of that, roughly. And so yeah, so the kids who live on the reserve now are struggling. There's some things they're why can't I speak all of a sudden? They're dealing with some things. Those things, some of them have their roots 100 odd years earlier with an Indian agent and starvation and massacres, and it got ugly. So then it goes back to the past, but it goes back to the past via letters that the Indian agent wrote to his wife, which is such an interesting way of doing things because you're not quite sure. I mean, first of all, an Indian agent writing about the Blackfeet doesn't seem like an inherently reliable narrator when it comes to anything about the Blackfeet. So you never quite know where you stand, and it's clear he's done something he feels guilty about, but you're not really clear what he did until the very end. And he writes about very strange interactions he has with a few of the Blackfeet people, one of them in particular. And there are just some very strange and uncertain things about that relationship, which is very interesting. And you don't really know why these two stories are being told interspersed with each other until the end. But yeah, it's really good. I liked it a lot. So I'll read more of his things that aren't so much blood everywhere because I can't cope with that. Where is it here? This is all out of order. Okay, so I read some, my books don't fall down, Edgar Allan Poe, because I was going to read some for Gothland November, because why not? But there was an audiobook that is included in the Audible membership until today. So I thought, well, if it's going to go away on the 1st of November, I should listen to some of the stories now. So I did. So one of them was The Fall of the House of Usher, which was pretty cool. I've got a few books here. So I've got The Fall of the House of Usher and Other Writings, and then Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And I feel like there's some overlap, but like some stories are in both of these books. This one has some poetry in it as well. The Murders of the Rue Morgue, that was a weird one. Mask of the Red Death. That was fun. I liked that one. I liked The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat. Essays and reviews. Oh yeah, he wrote, is it in this one? No, in the audiobook, he wrote an essay that was like a satirical essay about a magazine that he worked for. It was very funny. So yeah, I mean, I think I like his poetry the best. There are a few stories that I really like. There are some that are a bit silly and melodramatic. That's fine. You know, like, that's not an objection to them. It's just not my most favorite thing ever. What else is in here? Does this have a table of contents? No. Why not? That's annoying. Anyway, this Tales of Mystery and Imagination is just all the short stories. There's a lot of overlap between these two books. But yeah, some of the stories are lesser known. Some of them are fun. Some of them are kind of ridiculous, but it's still, you know, fun to read. I like his poetry the best, I think. So I've got the complete poems here. I don't know. I like the rhythm of them. He had an interesting ear for poetry, and he wrote about weird things. So, I mean, I'm all in favor of both of those things. So yeah, that was fun. Oops, sliding these back in here so I don't end up with books all over the place. Oh yeah, then I read The Frenchman's Creek. So this is not gothic. Where did it go? Here it is. It's not gothic. It's Daphne du Maurier. It is weird. It's basically, there's a Frenchman who is a pirate on a boat on a creek in Cornwall. Yeah. And it's exactly as weird as it sounds. But it's good fun. Like, there are moments of suspense. There's sort of a love story. There's suspenseful moments. And they're just fun, strange little piratey moments. It's a weird book, but I like it. An electrifying tale of love and scandal on the high seas. I mean, it's not actually on the high seas. It's on the coastline of Cornwall in a creek. But, you know, you can imagine some high seas. Ultra romantic mood and skillful storytelling. Yeah, it's fun. It's weird. It's fun. So that's that one. Then I read In the Dream House. So I actually listened to this on an audiobook as well. This is by Carmen Maria Machado. She wrote, what was that other book she wrote? Her Body and Other Parties, which was really good. And then this was sitting on my shelf for years, probably at this point. And I never got to it, and I never got to it. And then I thought, well, Gothlit November's coming up. It's sort of in that ballpark generally. I'll read it in advance of that. And it does have gothic-y moments. But it is a memoir of domestic violence. So it's not a cheerful memoir, but it is an incredible book. It's got one of the most interesting structures of a memoir I've ever read. I loved it. So each chapter, and some of them are very short, are Dream House as naming the animals, Dream House as ambiguity, Dream House as man versus self, Dream House as appetite, Dream House as romance novel. It is so inventive, a little bit depressing because it is about actual violence that was done to the author. But it's that psychological, I mean, there was some physical violence, but it's mostly that psychological violence that you feel like you have to try and justify something in your experience of psychological violence because there isn't physical evidence. So it ends up being a sort of, in this case, she said sort of thing, where not everybody in her circle believed what was happening to her because everything seemed fine and was very much not fine, hence the gothic element. But yeah, it's one of the best memoirs I think I've ever read in my life. It's so good. And then I read Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. this is one of the weirder books I've ever read, and that's not a bad thing. It does have a section that's making its rounds on social media where it has more F words than possibly any other book ever written. I kind of intellectually understand why that was the case, because there is a character development sort of reason for it. But it did, at the beginning of that section, get so excessive to the point where it just felt like a hammer on my head, and I have no idea what else was happening in that section. So if there were things that were important happening, I missed them altogether, because it was just the F word over and over and over and over forever, it felt like. And then eventually, if you keep going, you realize why that was the case. But yeah, I'm not sure if that was quite the goal, but maybe it was. I don't know. Anyway, it's in 3 parts. It's not really a sequel. It's not really a prequel. It's a little, well, one of the sections is sort of a prequel to the section. Well, I don't know. Trying to explain this book is difficult. It doesn't make any sense. It sort of lives alongside the other books rather than in any sort of linear progression. I mean, some of the things that happen in this book are the first things that happen in the development of Area X. So that was interesting. I feel like I have to read this whole series again from the beginning to find out what's going on. I don't know if I read them again, if I will find out what's going on. They're just so strange, but they are interesting, and the ecological messiness is really interesting. I'm not entirely opposed to plants taking over the world. But yeah, it was it's a strange book. Then I'm reading, I might finish it today, so I'll include it, Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, which is a werewolf story, but it's sort of a coming-of-age story. And so I like the werewolf bit, but I think I'm kind of tired of coming-of-age stories. Like, it's a good book. There's nothing wrong with it. I like it. I just think I'm personally kind of over that sort of period of life, and I'm more interested in other types of stories now. Speaking of which, in the Read Around the World Challenge, I got to add 2 countries to my list of countries this month. One was Folktales of Bhutan by Kunzang Chodin. So Bhutan is an interesting country that still doesn't really have a written literary tradition, but they have a really long oral tradition. And these folktales are the written down versions of oral stories. And reading them, I really did end up thinking, this would have been so much better as an audiobook. Maybe they can make one day. That would be cool. I mean, it's great that these folktales have been recorded, because, you know, the modern world is a disaster and violent and all that, and these sorts of things get lost or destroyed. So it was a cool list of stories. Some of the folktale elements were familiar from Western stories, some of them really unfamiliar, but it was really interesting. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about it other than, you know, it's the sort of thing that if you listen to it around a campfire would be even more fun. This book, okay, this author might be one of my new favorites. I'm not sure. I have to read more of her books to find out, because this is the only one I've read. This is On a Woman's Madness by Astrid Romer. She is a Suriname, how do you say that? Surinamese? I don't know. She's from Suriname. She lives in Holland now. And she's been compared to Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, and I can kind of see why. There's a power to her writing that sort of jolts you alert, and there are really beautiful moments alongside really brutal moments in the sort of same space. This book is, the chapters are super short. They're like little vignettes almost, some of them, and they jump back and forth between time periods, which gets a little bit confusing sometimes. But basically, this woman is bisexual, the main character, and black in Suriname. And her family, like her ancestors had been, and not very distant ancestors either, had been slaves of the Dutch in Suriname. And so there's this sort of larger discussion of racism and power dynamics in a post-slavery world of Suriname, and how that works or sometimes still doesn't really work for ordinary people who maybe don't fit. Like, I really like this main character because she really can't fit any of the assumptions that people make about her. Like, anything that people think is appropriate for women, for black women, for whatever. She can't do it. She just can't make herself fit into that box. It is never going to work for her. And so she struggles a lot, of course, because that's what happens when you can't do that. But yeah, so there were some confusing moments, but overall it's a really powerful, beautiful book, and I want to read more by this author now. So yeah, that was cool. That was On a Woman's Madness. It does, speaking of the title, there is some discussion also about, like, when women can't fit into that box. Does that mean they're crazy? Some people argue yes, still. And then I listened to a couple audiobooks by Vladimir Nabokov. I read Lolita in university and loved it. It's gorgeous. It's disturbing. It is not a love story. And usually men who think it's a love story just are not being intellectually honest, I think. But his writing is so good. Like, he was an incredible talent. And the quality of his work was astonishing. So I read Bend Sinister, which is sort of, if 1984 was more, I don't know, literary? That sounds insulting to 1984. I like 1984. So I'm not trying to insult it, but this is a different take on a fictional authoritarian system and what it does to people. And it's so good. And then I read Pale Fire, which is another super weird book. It's the structure of the book it's a 999 line poem followed by commentary and an index. And both of those things are part of the novel. Even the index is part of the novel. It tells you information about the characters. Some of the index points are really funny. He does have a strange sense of humor, Nabokov. I'm gonna have to reread that. I mean, I have to reread both of them one day, but Pale Fire I'm gonna have to reread because it is so strange that it's a bit disorienting. But basically, there's this professor or somebody, not entirely clear if his credentials are what he says they are, who's writing the commentary on this poem of the author who's passed away, I believe. So there's a footnote every, like, 2 or 3 words in this poem. So you read the poem first, and then you read, 3 words of the poem, and then this explanatory note. And through these explanatory notes, you get this very strange, fascinating story, and learn more about the commentator as well. And he may not be a reliable source of information. So yeah, it's pretty cool. As experimental books go, I also read, and don't have it here apparently, well, I do have it somewhere. Oh, here it is. Between the Acts by Virginia Woolf. Her writing in it is very beautiful, and the structure is so cool because it's a sort of stream of consciousness story told between the acts of a community theater production. So the premise is very interesting, and the way it's organized is very interesting. There were times where it's about as cringeworthy as watching a community theater production. So there was that. So for that reason, I didn't like it as much as, like, The Waves or To the Lighthouse. Because there were just moments where you were like, guys, no. Come on. Some of it was a bit cringeworthy, but it was, yeah. This month's theme seems to be inventive novel structures, I guess. I listened to Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange, which is sort of a sequel to There, in that some of the characters are the same, but you can read it as a standalone, I think. And in fact, it had been such a long time since I'd read There that I couldn't remember most of it, until things were referenced sometimes in the book, and I was like, oh yeah, I vaguely remember that. But it's not strictly necessary. So it's about, basically it's about the impact of residential schools on these Indigenous kids of today and on their great grandparents and the generations between. So it gets pretty violent. Like, there's a lot of, even when there's not physical violence, there's a lot of emotional violence that people have had to deal with. So there's that. For a completely different change of pace, I read, because this was part of the literary, what was it called? The Literary Tarot, the classics one. Henry Fielding's History of Tom Jones of Handley. The story of the book was not interesting, but 1740's pacing is really slow. Like, really slow. Like, I thought Middlemarch was leisurely. I mean, it's practically a thriller compared to this one. Yeah, I don't think this one's quite for me. It did go on. It could have been, like, it's not a small book. It could have been probably half the length with modern editing sort of approaches. But yeah, I'm not gonna reread that one because it was slow. Really slow. Like, everything, every way you could possibly think of to say something, he took about what would be one sentence in a modern novel was probably about, 5 or 6 paragraphs. It was special. Anyway, I'll stop. Then I read Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton. I think I read this because it came in as an audiobook in my library. And he's a white writer, but he wrote this just a few years before apartheid started in South Africa. And it's just such a sad book. It's so, like, the lengths to which people had to go to feel like they belonged in their own country was unbelievable. And he was very much opposed to apartheid, even though he was a white South African. And he protested against it, and I think he might have done jail time for that. And then died just a few years before apartheid was ended. Unfortunately, he didn't get to see that happen. But there's a Zulu pastor and his son Absalom who he murders somebody. I'm not going to describe the circumstances, but basically if it was a white person murdering a black person in the same scenario, there's like a 99.9% chance it would be ruled self-defense. And so it's just, he goes through this whole court case. He gives himself up to the police eventually. He had a couple friends with him. It gets really ugly, and it's just so hopeless. He did not, clearly the author was not going to be in favor of apartheid, even though this was written a few years before that was instituted. But I'm not sure after reading this book that he had much hope that it wouldn't be instituted, if that makes sense. Like, it was just such the way in which black people were mistreated by the white people there were just, like, every way, all the ways. Yeah. So if you want to read a sad book, it's a sad book. This is a fascinating book. Okay, this continues the weird, interesting structures of books. This is If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler by Italo Calvino. It is astonishing. It is so good, but so weird. So I knew I loved it from jump, like from the very first sentences. I was like, oh, I like this book already, and I've only just started. It was originally written in Italian. Anyway, basically, I don't know if I'll be able to explain this very well, but it starts out with you as the reader trying to read a book. He describes your experience of reading the book in brilliant ways. It's really good. It sounds maybe a bit silly, but the execution of this is exceptional. But then you end up with a book that is, there's been a publishing error where some of the pages are missing and then some pages from a different book are inserted. So then there's this whole back and forth with the bookstore about trying to get the book of the two of those books, the book that you actually want to read, and is that going to have the other pages? It's all very confused. It's like a meta novel or something. I don't know. Is that a way to describe? I don't know if that's a correct way to describe it, but I don't even know how to explain it. It's so weird. Okay, so maybe I'll read you the first few sentences because it's also really funny. You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. Relax. Concentrate. Dispel every other thought. Let the world around you fade. Best to close the door. The TV is always on in the next room. Tell the others right away, no, I don't want to watch TV. Raise your voice. They won't hear you otherwise. I'm reading. I don't want to be disturbed. Maybe they haven't heard you. With all that racket, speak louder. Yell. I'm beginning to read Italo Calvino's new novel. Or, if you prefer, don't say anything. Just hope they'll leave you alone. Find the most comfortable position. Seated, stretched out, curled up, or lying flat. Flat on your back, on your side, on your stomach, in an easy chair, on the sofa, in the rocker, the deck chair, on the hassock. In the hammock, if you have a hammock. On top of your bed, of course, or in the bed. You can even stand on your hands, head down in the yoga position, with the book upside down, naturally. Of course, the ideal position for reading is something you can never find. In the old days, they used to read standing up at a lectern. People were accustomed to standing on their feet without moving. They rested like that when they were tired of horseback riding. Nobody ever thought of reading on horseback, and yet now, the idea of sitting on the saddle, the book propped against the horse's mane, or maybe tied to the horse's ear with a special harness, seems attractive to you. With your feet in the stirrups, you should feel quite comfortable for reading. Having your feet up is the first condition for enjoying a read. That's the first page. Eventually, at one point, you get more of the actual story of this new novel that you're reading. And it doesn't get any less strange, but it's always fun. It's an incredible book. I'm gonna have to reread it too and read more from him, because I've never read anything by him, but it was incredible. Okay, then I listened to Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. This was by an economist in, I want to say like the 80s or something. It's not a new book, but it's really a critique of this constant, like, relentless growth economy that we've got going, which is destroying the planet and killing people. And so it looks at other options, like what if people mattered in our economic system? And it's really good. There are a few moments where you're like, this is a bit out of date because it was written in the 70s or 80s. He makes a couple of assumptions about the economic role of women where I'm like, really? Are we sure about that? But overall, it's a really good book. I enjoyed that one. I also enjoyed A Short History of Ireland from 1500 to 2000. It really is a short history. It's a very brief overview, and it doesn't go far enough back in history for me. Basically, it starts with England causing all sorts of problems, as they did, which is exciting for everybody. And by the end, you really are very clear as to why everybody wanted to kick out the English. They did not treat people other than themselves at all well. So yeah, it's an interesting book. I do have some Irish ancestry, and I've read books about Irish sort of witchy practices. So I wanted to know more about the history, because you don't learn that in school in Canada. You learn some English history in school in Canada, but not Irish. Then the last couple, if my collection does fall over, are I read the autobiography of Gandhi, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, and that really is a very good subtitle. It's a fascinating book. He was a very strange person. The one creepy thing that doesn't come up is that experiment where he was sleeping next to girls to try and restrain himself or whatever. But reading this book, you realize he probably didn't think that was weird, because he did a lot of weird things along those lines, like with food, with just all sorts of worldly goods. He tried to live with as much restraint as possible, to do as little harm as possible. That was the idea. That might not always have been the result, but that was the goal. And so this is the story of his various experiments, and it's really interesting. He was, yeah, very strange, very interesting. He did, I mean, it was pretty gutsy standing up to both the South African apartheid government and the British in India the way he did. Like, people think now of the British in a very different way, but they were extremely powerful then, and they killed a lot of people, the British Empire at that time. So it was pretty gutsy. And he does own up to a lot of his mistakes in this book, especially to do with his family, his relationship with his kids and stuff like that. He does discuss as not being maybe what he would have wished, but you know, in retrospect, right? Like, you do the best you can and then hope they don't need a therapist when they're grown up. But yeah, it was a very interesting book. I do recommend that, even though I realize he's gotten to be a bit of a more controversial figure these days. But I also think the idea that everybody needs to be, like, every historical figure is going to be unproblematic is a bit ridiculous. That's not a thing that happens. People are messy and complicated and do stupid things. And do incredible things, sometimes in the same day. Like, that's just how it is. And then the last one is Driven, The Secret Lives of Drivers. So this is about taxi drivers, Uber drivers. I wasn't sure if this book was for me, but I really liked his book, Pay No Heed to the Rockets, which is about Palestinian writers. It's phenomenal. If you have a chance to read that one, it's very good. And so I wasn't sure if I'd like this one, because I have no particular interest in taxis or driving or anything. I don't actually like being in cars. But, you know, it's a bit like it's just a good reminder, this book, I think, that any assumptions that you make about a group of people, you should probably question, because there's so much diversity within any group, that you really can't safely make any sort of sweeping assumptions about what people want or like or need or hate or what their hopes are for their lives. Like, it's just, the world is messy and complicated, and this was a really good book about all sorts of different people who drive other people. One of the really cool sections was about Indigenous people in, I want to say, Winnipeg, who started their own little sub taxi service on Facebook, where they only drove each other and kept tabs on each other. Like, you had to check in to make sure everybody was safe, and then they would pick up other Indigenous women, because there is Indigenous women and girls going missing in Canada is an enormous problem, and it's not being addressed by, like, anybody seriously at the moment, as far as I can tell. And so they wanted to try and keep each other safe, and they didn't feel safe in just regular taxis or Ubers or whatever, so they started their own service for each other, and that was really cool. So yeah, that was my October reading. It was really varied and fascinating, and I enjoyed it. And now I'm going to start reading some. Actually, I started the other night at the opera, the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Literature, which is so fun. So yeah, next up, Goth Lit November. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.